Nihilism, does life have any meaning at all? Nihilism is the philosophical position that life lacks inherent meaning, purpose, or value. It challenges the very foundations of morality, truth, and existence itself. But if nothing truly matters, how are we supposed to live? And does this perspective lead to despair or liberation? The roots of nihilism can be traced to thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, who famously declared, "God is dead." Nietzsche didn't mean that a deity literally died, but that the traditional sources of meaning, religion, morality, and absolute values no longer hold authority in modern life. If the structures that once guided humanity collapse, how do we orient ourselves? Nihilism comes in different forms. Existential nihilism claims that life itself has no ultimate purpose. Moral nihilism denies objective moral truths. Epistemological nihilism questions whether knowledge or truth is possible at all. Each variation shakes a different pillar of what humans rely on for certainty. But is nihilism a warning, or a liberation from illusions we never questioned? Critics argue that nihilism can be paralyzing, leading to apathy, cynicism, or even destructive behavior. Yet some philosophers, including Nietzsche, suggested that facing the void honestly could empower individuals. Once we accept that meaning is not given, we can create our own values, define our own purpose, and live authentically. Could confronting nothingness be the first step toward freedom? Nihilism forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. If there is no inherent meaning, what do we choose to value? And if life is a blank canvas, what will we paint upon it? So the enduring puzzle remains. Is nihilism a doorway to despair, stripping life of all significance? Or a challenge, inviting us to forge meaning in a world without guarantees? Absurdism, how do we live in a meaningless world? Absurdism is the philosophical idea, most famously articulated by Albert Camus, that humans naturally seek meaning in life, yet the universe offers none. This clash, the tension between our search for purpose and the universe's indifference, is what Camus calls the absurd. But if life is absurd, how should we respond? Do we despair, rebel, or embrace the chaos? Camus illustrates the absurd through the story of Sisyphus, condemned to endlessly push a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down. On the surface, his task is pointless. Yet Camus famously concludes that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, finding value in the struggle itself. Could our meaning come not from the universe, but from how we engage with it? Absurdism differs from nihilism in a subtle but important way. Nihilism often concludes that nothing matters. Absurdism, by contrast, acknowledges the lack of inherent meaning, but insists that we can still create our own purpose, however temporary or fragile. The world may not grant answers, but we can still live fully and passionately. But how do we choose our purpose without illusion? Daily life offers countless encounters with the absurd. We strive for goals, face mortality, wrestle with uncertainty, and experience randomness. Absurdism asks us not to seek certainty or ultimate resolution, but to act authentically in spite of it. Is courage in the face of absurdity the true measure of freedom? In the end, absurdism challenges us to live consciously. We cannot escape the tension between desire for meaning and the universe's silence, but we can embrace it, create, and engage with life as it comes. So the central question persists: do we succumb to despair when confronted with the absurd? Or do we, like Sisyphus, find joy in the struggle itself? Authenticity, living true to yourself. Authenticity is the philosophical idea of being true to your own values, beliefs, and identity, rather than simply conforming to external pressures or societal expectations. But what does it really mean to live authentically? And is it even possible in a world full of rules, norms, and influences? Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger emphasized authenticity as a key to meaningful life. To live authentically is to acknowledge your freedom, confront your responsibilities, and make choices that reflect who you truly are. But does being authentic mean rejecting all social expectations? or finding a balance between individuality and community. Authenticity is not a one-time achievement. It is an ongoing process. It requires honest reflection, courage to act on your beliefs, and resistance to self-deception. Everyday life presents countless challenges: the pressure to fit in, fear of judgment, and the temptation to adopt ready-made identities. How do we navigate these without losing ourselves? Living authentically also involves accepting your limitations and mortality. It means embracing your strengths and weaknesses, your desires and fears, and making decisions in alignment with your values. But does authenticity always lead to happiness? Or is it sometimes a lonely path demanding sacrifice and courage? In the end, authenticity asks a fundamental question: who am I? And am I living in a way that is faithful to myself, rather than merely following the roles assigned by society? Alienation: feeling separated from the world and yourself. Alienation is the experience of being disconnected from society, from other people, or even from one's own sense of self. But why do humans feel alienated in the first place? And is this separation a modern problem, or has it always been part of human existence? Philosophers like Karl Marx and existentialists explored alienation in different ways. Marx focused on social and economic alienation, arguing that workers become estranged from the products of their labor, from the labor process itself, and from other people under conditions of capitalism. But what does it mean to be disconnected from the very work that sustains you? Existentialist thinkers, including Sartre and Heidegger, emphasized personal alienation, the sense of estrangement from oneself, from authentic choices, or from the meaning of life. We may go through life performing roles, following routines, and obeying external expectations without ever feeling truly connected to who we are. How do we reconcile these pressures with the desire to live authentically? Alienation can manifest in many forms: boredom, anxiety, disillusionment, or a sense of emptiness. Yet recognizing alienation is also the first step toward transformation. By confronting our disconnection, we can seek authenticity, community, and deeper engagement with life. Can alienation, then, be a doorway to growth? Ultimately, alienation raises a fundamental question: how do we live fully in a world where disconnection is almost inevitable? And how do we bridge the gap between who we are and the world we inhabit? Freedom and determinism: are our choices truly ours? Freedom and determinism explore the tension between human free will and the idea that every event, including our actions, is caused by prior events or natural laws. But do we really have control over our choices? Or are we simply following a chain of causes beyond our awareness? Determinism suggests that everything that happens is the inevitable result of preceding conditions. From the motion of planets to the firing of neurons in the brain, the universe unfolds according to laws and patterns. If this is true, can we truly claim to be free? On the other hand, the notion of freedom insists that humans are capable of making choices that are not fully predetermined. We can reflect, deliberate, and act according to our own values. But if freedom exists, how does it coexist with the apparent predictability of natural laws? Philosophers have proposed several ways to reconcile these ideas. Compatibilism argues that freedom and determinism can coexist, that we are free when we act according to our desires, even if those desires have causes. Hard determinism rejects freedom entirely, claiming that all actions are predetermined. Libertarian free will insists on a stronger form of freedom, where some choices are genuinely uncaused. Which perspective is closer to reality? This debate affects morality, responsibility, and law. If our actions are determined, can we hold people accountable? If we are free, how do we understand influence, circumstance, and unconscious bias? Ultimately, freedom and determinism challenge us to think deeply about what it means to be human. Are we authors of our destiny, or actors following a script written by the universe? Free will: are we truly in control of our choices? Free will is the idea that humans have the capacity to make choices independent of external forces or causal chains. But do we really decide freely? Or are our decisions always influenced by biology, environment, or fate? The concept of free will has been debated for centuries. Some argue that our sense of choice is an illusion, that every decision is predetermined by prior events, genetics, or social conditioning. But if that's true, how do we explain our experience of deliberation, reflection, and moral responsibility? Others defend free will as real and essential. To act freely is to exercise our agency, make decisions aligned with our values, and take responsibility for our lives. Without free will, can ethics, praise, or blame even make sense? Philosophers have explored different perspectives. Libertarian free will asserts that some choices are genuinely uncaused, giving humans true autonomy. Compatibilism suggests that free will can exist even within a deterministic universe, as long as our actions align with our internal desires and reasoning. Hard determinism denies free will entirely, viewing it as a comforting illusion. Which view matches reality? The debate matters because it shapes how we understand ourselves, our morality, and our society. If free will is real, we are responsible for shaping our destiny. If it's illusory, perhaps compassion and understanding take priority over judgment. So the essential question remains, do we truly control our actions? Or is the freedom we feel only a story our mind tells us about causality? Compatibilism. Can freedom and determinism coexist? Compatibilism is the philosophical position that free will and determinism are compatible, that even if our actions are influenced or determined by prior causes, we can still be considered free when we act according to our own motivations and reasoning. But how can freedom exist in a world governed by cause and effect? Compatibilists argue that true freedom is not about being uncaused or completely independent, but about acting voluntarily, without coercion, and in alignment with our values. For example, if you choose to help a friend because you care, even though your desires have causes, you are acting freely. But does this kind of freedom feel the same as the kind we imagine in absolute terms? This approach offers a middle ground between the extremes of hard determinism, which denies freedom, and libertarian free will, which insists on completely uncaused choices. Compatibilism reframes freedom in a practical, human-centered way. It focuses on our ability to reflect, deliberate, and act according to our reasoning. Can this practical sense of freedom satisfy our deepest intuitions about choice? Compatibilism also impacts ethics and responsibility. If our actions are caused but still reflect our intentions and values, then praise, blame, and accountability remain meaningful. But if freedom is only partial or conditional, how do we draw the line between responsibility and circumstance? In the end, compatibilism challenges us to reconsider what freedom really means. Can we truly be free, even in a deterministic universe? Or is this freedom only an illusion that feels real because we can act according to our own reasoning? Hard determinism. Is free will an illusion? Hard determinism is the philosophical view that every event, including human actions, is determined by prior causes, leaving no room for true free will. But if our choices are predetermined, can we ever be responsible for anything we do? And if freedom is an illusion, what does that mean for morality, society, and our sense of self? Hard determinists argue that everything unfolds according to laws of nature, biology, and prior events. Our thoughts, desires, and decisions are all part of this causal chain. In this view, even deliberation is determined. We only think we are freely deciding. But if this is true, how do we reconcile the deep human experience of choice and agency? This perspective contrasts sharply with libertarian free will, which posits genuinely uncaused choices, and with compatibilism, which finds a middle ground. Hard determinism is stark and uncompromising. The universe operates like clockwork, and humans are no exception. But does acknowledging this remove meaning from life? Or does it free us from self-blame and guilt, allowing us to understand ourselves and others more compassionately? Hard determinism raises challenging questions about ethics and law. If actions are predetermined, can punishment or praise ever make sense? Or should our focus shift toward rehabilitation, understanding causes and shaping conditions to produce better outcomes? Ultimately, hard determinism forces us to confront a sobering question. Are we truly in control of our lives? Or is every thought, decision, and action simply part of an unbroken chain of cause and effect? Panpsychism: is consciousness everywhere? Panpsychism is the philosophical idea that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, present in all matter, from the smallest particles to the largest systems. But can rocks, atoms, or electrons really have any form of experience? And if consciousness is everywhere, what does that mean for our understanding of life, mind, and reality? This view challenges the common assumption that consciousness emerges only in complex brains. Instead, panpsychists suggest that some form of subjective experience exists at all levels of existence. Even if it is extremely simple or primitive, it may be a building block for the complex consciousness we experience. But how do we make sense of this proto-consciousness? Panpsychism has intrigued philosophers, scientists, and thinkers because it offers a potential solution to the hard problem of consciousness. The puzzle of how physical matter can give rise to subjective experience. If consciousness is fundamental, then it doesn't emerge mysteriously. It is already part of the fabric of reality. But if everything is conscious in some sense, how do we distinguish humans from rocks or animals from electrons? This idea also raises ethical and metaphysical questions. If consciousness is ubiquitous, does that expand our moral responsibilities? Could even seemingly inanimate objects possess a form of experience that deserves consideration? Ultimately, panpsychism asks a radical question about the nature of reality. Is mind something rare and special, confined to brains? Or is consciousness a fundamental aspect of the universe, woven into everything we see and touch? Philosophy of mind: understanding consciousness and the self. Philosophy of mind is the study of mental phenomena, consciousness, and the relationship between mind and body. It asks questions about what it means to think, feel, perceive, and be aware. But what exactly is the mind? And how does it relate to the physical body and the brain? One of the central questions in philosophy of mind is the mind-body problem. Are mental states purely physical, or is there something non-physical about consciousness? Dualists argue that mind and body are separate, while physicalists claim that all mental phenomena can ultimately be explained by brain processes. But which view reflects reality? Other major topics include consciousness, intentionality, and the nature of experience. What does it mean to have subjective experience, to feel pain, or to perceive the world? Can thoughts and emotions be reduced to neural activity, or is there an irreducible quality to experience? Philosophy of mind also explores questions of personal identity. What makes you the same person over time? How do memories, personality, and consciousness combine to create a continuous sense of self? And how do these insights connect to ethics, artificial intelligence, and the possibility of other minds? Ultimately, the philosophy of mind challenges us to understand who we are and how our inner experiences relate to the physical world. Are we merely biological machines? Or is there a deeper, perhaps even mysterious, dimension to consciousness that science and philosophy continue to explore? Consciousness: what is it like to be aware? Consciousness is the state of being aware of yourself, your thoughts, sensations, and the world around you. But what does it truly mean to be conscious? And why does subjective experience exist at all? Philosophers call the question of why and how physical processes in the brain produce subjective experience the hard problem of consciousness. We can study neural activity, behavior, and cognition, but can science ever fully explain the feeling of what it is like to see red, taste chocolate or feel pain. Consciousness has many layers. There is phenomenal consciousness, raw subjective experience, and access consciousness, the thoughts and perceptions we can report, reflect on, and act upon. But how do these layers relate to one another? Different philosophical approaches try to explain consciousness. Physicalism argues that consciousness arises entirely from brain processes. Dualism claims that mind and body are fundamentally separate. Panpsychism suggests that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, but which, if any, approach captures reality. The study of consciousness also raises ethical and existential questions. How do we treat beings with consciousness? Humans, animals, or potentially artificial intelligences? And how does understanding consciousness shape our sense of identity, responsibility, and meaning? In the end, consciousness reminds us of a profound mystery. Why is there something it is like to exist? And how does awareness shape the very way we experience life itself? Qualia, the building blocks of experience. Qualia are the individual subjective experiences of perception, the what it feels like aspect of consciousness. For example, the redness of red, the bitterness of coffee, or the sound of a violin. But what exactly are qualia? And can they ever be fully explained by science or physical processes? Philosophers use qualia to explore the limits of physical explanations of the mind. Even if we understand all the neural activity behind seeing red, can we truly capture the experience itself? This raises a fundamental question. Is there something about consciousness that is irreducible to objective measurement? Qualia are central to debates in philosophy of mind, particularly the hard problem of consciousness. Some argue that qualia prove that subjective experience is more than just brain activity. Others suggest that qualia may eventually be explained by neurobiology or cognitive science. But if qualia are real, what does that mean for our understanding of reality? The discussion of qualia also touches on empathy and ethics. Understanding that every being has its own subjective experiences can deepen our appreciation of other minds. But how can we ever truly know what another being experiences? In the end, qualia challenge us to confront the richness of consciousness. They ask, what is it like to be alive? And can the mysteries of experience ever be fully captured in words, science, or thought? Dual aspect theory, mind and matter as two sides of the same coin. Dual aspect theory is the philosophical idea that the mental and the physical are two aspects of the same underlying reality. Instead of seeing mind and body as separate, or trying to reduce one to the other, this view suggests that both perspectives are equally fundamental. But what does this mean for understanding consciousness? And how does it change the way we see ourselves and the world? According to this theory, every physical process has a mental aspect, and every mental experience corresponds to a physical process. For example, the firing of neurons in the brain is not just a physical event. It also has a subjective, experiential side. But if mind and matter are two sides of the same thing, can we ever fully grasp both perspectives at once? Dual aspect theory offers a middle ground between strict physicalism, which reduces mind to matter, and dualism, which separates mind and body completely. It suggests that reality cannot be fully understood from a single perspective. But if true, does this mean that science alone can never explain consciousness? This approach also raises fascinating questions about identity, perception, and ethics. If mental and physical aspects are inseparable, does that change the way we think about other beings, their experiences, or our responsibilities toward them? Ultimately, dual aspect theory challenges us to expand our understanding of reality. Can we accept that mind and matter are two faces of the same underlying existence? And what does that reveal about the nature of consciousness and the universe itself? Identity theory. Is mind just the brain? Identity theory is the philosophical position that mental states are identical to physical brain states. In other words, every thought, feeling, or perception corresponds directly to a specific neurological event. But if this is true, does that mean our minds are nothing more than the activity of neurons? And what does this imply about consciousness and personal identity? This theory challenges dualist views, which separate mind and body, by suggesting a direct one-to-one correlation between mental experiences and brain processes. For example, the experience of pain is identical to a particular pattern of neural firing. But if mental states are purely physical, how do we account for the subjective quality of experience? The what it feels like aspect or qualia. Identity theory also influences debates in neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and cognitive science. If the mind is the brain, could replicating brain processes in a machine produce consciousness? Or is there something inherently unique about biological experience? Critics argue that identity theory may oversimplify the richness of mental life. It explains correlations, but does it fully explain experience itself? And if all mental phenomena are brain states, does that reduce human thought and emotion to mere chemistry and electricity? Ultimately, identity theory asks a profound question. Are our thoughts, feelings, and sense of self nothing more than physical processes? Or is there an additional layer of reality that science has yet to uncover? Functionalism, understanding the mind by its functions. Functionalism is the philosophical theory that mental states are defined by what they do rather than by what they are made of. In other words, it's not the substance of the mind that matters, but how it functions, how it processes inputs, produces outputs, and interacts with the world. But what does it really mean to define the mind by its functions? According to functionalism, pain, for example, is not just a neural event. It is a state that is caused by certain stimuli, produces particular behaviors, and interacts with other mental states. This allows for the possibility that different physical systems, humans, animals, or even machines, could have similar mental states if they perform the same functions. But if function defines the mind, could a computer ever truly have experiences? Functionalism offers a flexible alternative to identity theory and dualism. It emphasizes roles and relationships over physical composition, making it particularly useful for understanding artificial intelligence and cognitive science. But if mental states are purely functional, what happens to the subjective quality of experience, the qualia that seem uniquely human? This theory also raises questions about personal identity, consciousness, and moral consideration. If mental states can exist in multiple forms, does that expand our understanding of minds beyond humans? And how do we evaluate consciousness in entities that function similarly but are physically different? Ultimately, functionalism challenges us to think about the mind in terms of capabilities, relations, and effects, rather than substance. Can understanding the mind functionally capture the essence of thought and experience? Or are we missing something vital about the richness of conscious life? Eliminative materialism. Do our common mental concepts even exist? Eliminative materialism is the philosophical view that our everyday mental concepts, like beliefs, desires, or emotions, might be fundamentally flawed and could eventually be eliminated by a mature neuroscience. But does this mean that what we think of as thoughts or feelings don't really exist? And if so, what does that imply for our understanding of ourselves? Proponents argue that common-sense psychology, often called folk psychology, is an outdated framework. As neuroscience advances, it may reveal that our ordinary ideas about mental states are inaccurate or misleading. For example, when we say, "I believe X," there may not be a discrete mental entity corresponding to that belief. But if our mental vocabulary is wrong, how do we communicate and make sense of experience? Eliminative materialism challenges traditional views of the mind, such as dualism or identity theory, by suggesting that some aspects of conscious experience may not have a straightforward neural correlate. It forces us to ask, are beliefs, desires, and intentions real, or are they convenient fictions we use to navigate social life? This perspective also raises deep questions about responsibility, ethics, and self-understanding. If our mental states are mischaracterized by folk psychology, can we still hold people accountable in the ways we assume? And how does this reshape our conception of consciousness and identity? Ultimately, eliminative materialism confronts us with a radical possibility that our common understanding of the mind may be wrong, and that a truly scientific account could replace it entirely. Are we ready to rethink what it means to think, feel, and exist? Extended mind thesis. Is the mind only inside the brain? The extended mind thesis is the philosophical idea that our mind is not confined to our brain or body, but can extend into the environment through tools, devices, and interactions. But what does it mean to say that objects outside of us can be part of our mind? And how far does this extension go? According to this view, items like notebooks, smartphones, or computers can serve as external memory, reasoning tools, or cognitive extensions. For example, writing notes or using a calculator isn't just a convenience. It can be considered part of our cognitive process. But if our mind extends into the world, where do we draw the boundary between self and environment? Philosophers Andy Clark and David Chalmers popularized this thesis, arguing that cognition is not limited to the skull, but is a dynamic process involving interaction with the surroundings. This challenges traditional views that locate thinking purely within the brain. But does this mean that anyone using the same tool shares the same mind in some sense? The extended mind thesis also impacts ethics, responsibility, and education. If parts of our thinking exist outside us, how do we consider ownership, privacy, and accountability for thoughts and decisions? And what does this mean for artificial intelligence and human-machine collaboration? Ultimately, the extended mind thesis asks us to rethink what it means to be a thinking, conscious being. Is the mind an isolated organ inside our head? Or is it an open system, spread across tools, people, and the world around us? Personal identity. What makes you the same person over time? Personal identity is the philosophical question of what it is that makes someone the same person throughout their life, despite changes in body, mind, and experiences. But what truly defines you? Is it your memory, your personality, your body, or something else entirely? One perspective is the psychological approach, which suggests that continuity of memory, beliefs, and consciousness maintains identity. If you can remember past experiences and connect them to your present self, you remain the same person. But what happens if memory fades or changes? Another view is the bodily approach, which claims that your physical body, or perhaps your brain, is the primary basis of identity. But if your body or brain changes over time, does that threaten who you are? Philosophers also consider the narrative approach, which argues that identity is created through the stories we tell about our lives. Are we the sum of our experiences and the way we interpret them? And how do relationships, society, and culture shape our sense of self? The question of personal identity has practical implications for ethics, law, and responsibility. If someone changes dramatically over time, are they still accountable for past actions? And how does understanding identity influence how we view mortality, growth, and selfhood? Ultimately, personal identity challenges us to ask, what does it mean to be you? And what is the essence that persists through all the changes, experiences, and challenges of life? Ship of Theseus. When does something remain the same? The Ship of Theseus is a classic philosophical thought experiment that asks, if you gradually replace every part of a ship, is it still the same ship? And what does this tell us about identity, objects, and even ourselves? Imagine a ship where one plank is replaced at a time. Over years, every part is eventually swapped. Is it still the Ship of Theseus? Now imagine all the old planks are reassembled into a new ship. Which one is the real ship? This puzzle challenges our intuitions about persistence, change, and identity. But why does it feel difficult to answer? The thought experiment extends beyond ships to people and objects. Our bodies constantly change. cells die, memories fade, and experiences reshape us. Are we still the same person we were years ago? How do we define continuity and identity when everything is in flux? Philosophers use the ship of Theseus to explore broader questions. Is identity about material continuity, form and function, or perceived sameness? And how do these ideas influence ethics, responsibility, and the way we think about ourselves and the world? Ultimately, the ship of Theseus reminds us that identity is not always straightforward. Can something remain the same even as it changes completely? And what does that reveal about the nature of objects, people, and existence itself? Ethics understanding right, wrong, and moral life. Ethics is the branch of philosophy that explores questions of right and wrong, good and bad, and how we should live. But what does it truly mean to act morally? And how do we decide which actions are right and which are wrong? Throughout history, philosophers have proposed different approaches to ethics. Virtue ethics emphasizes developing good character traits like courage, honesty, and kindness to guide behavior. Consequentialism suggests that the morality of an action depends on its outcomes. The greater the good, the better the action. But can we always predict the consequences? Other approaches include Deontology, which argues that certain actions are inherently right or wrong, regardless of outcomes, and moral relativism, which claims that ethical standards depend on culture or individual perspective. But if morality varies, is there any universal right or wrong? Ethics is not just theoretical. It affects everyday life, from personal decisions to societal laws. How do we navigate conflicts between self-interest, the well-being of others, and broader social responsibilities? And how do we balance moral duties when they clash? Ultimately, ethics challenges us to examine our values and choices. What does it mean to live a good life? And how can we make decisions that reflect integrity, compassion, and wisdom in an often complex and uncertain world? Virtue ethics, living a good life through character. Virtue ethics is a branch of moral philosophy that emphasizes developing good character traits, or virtues, to guide our actions and decisions. But what does it really mean to live virtuously? And how do virtues shape the way we interact with the world and others? Originating with Aristotle, virtue ethics suggests that moral behavior is not just about following rules or calculating outcomes, but about cultivating qualities like courage, honesty, generosity, and wisdom. The goal is to become a person who naturally acts well and flourishes in life. But how do we determine which traits are truly virtuous? Virtue ethics also focuses on practical wisdom, the ability to apply virtues appropriately in different situations. Life is complex and uncertain, and virtues guide us in making thoughtful and balanced choices. But if virtues vary across cultures and contexts, is there a universal standard of good character? This approach highlights the importance of habit and practice. By consistently exercising virtues, we shape our character and develop moral insight. But what happens when our environment or circumstances challenge our virtues? Ultimately, virtue ethics asks us to consider not just what we do, but who we become. How can we cultivate a character that leads to a flourishing, meaningful life? And how do virtues help us navigate the moral challenges we encounter every day? Stoicism, mastering the mind and embracing what we can control. Stoicism is an ancient philosophical school that emphasizes rational control, virtue, and living in accordance with nature. But what does it mean to be a Stoic in today's world? And how can Stoic principles help us navigate challenges, emotions, and uncertainty? At its core, Stoicism teaches that we should focus on what is within our control, our thoughts, judgments, and actions, and accept what is outside our control, like external events, other people's actions, or natural occurrences. But how do we practice this in everyday life? Stoics like Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius taught that true freedom comes from mastering the mind and emotions, rather than seeking external possessions or approval. Virtue, wisdom, courage, and justice are the path to a flourishing life. But how can we remain calm and rational when faced with adversity, loss, or injustice? Stoicism also encourages reflection, self-discipline, and resilience. By examining our judgments and desires, we learn to align ourselves with reason and the natural order. But can this philosophy help us maintain inner peace without becoming detached or indifferent? Ultimately, Stoicism challenges us to ask, how can we live a life guided by reason, virtue, and acceptance? And how can we cultivate strength of character to face the inevitable difficulties of human existence? Epicureanism, seeking pleasure wisely and living calmly. Epicureanism is an ancient philosophical system that emphasizes the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain as the path to a happy life. But what does it really mean to seek pleasure wisely? And how do we balance enjoyment with virtue and reason? Founded by Epicurus, this philosophy teaches that not all pleasures are equal. Mental pleasures, friendship, tranquility, and freedom from fear are far more valuable than fleeting or excessive physical pleasures. But how can we cultivate lasting happiness without falling into overindulgence or harm? Epicureanism also encourages understanding the natural world and the limits of desire. By recognizing what is truly necessary, food, shelter, friendship, and knowledge, we can free ourselves from unnecessary anxiety and superstition. But how do we maintain this calm in a world full of distractions and societal pressures? This philosophy emphasizes moderation, self-reflection, and the avoidance of pain, both physical and emotional. By living simply and wisely, we can achieve ataraxia, a state of inner peace and contentment. But is this calmness truly achievable for everyone, or is it an ideal to strive toward? Ultimately, Epicureanism asks us, how can we live a life of measured pleasure, tranquility, and understanding? And how do we create conditions for enduring happiness amidst the complexities of life? Hedonism, is pleasure the highest good? Hedonism is the philosophical idea that pleasure and the avoidance of pain are the primary or most important goals of life. But what does it truly mean to pursue pleasure? And can a life devoted to pleasure lead to lasting happiness or fulfillment? There are different forms of hedonism. Psychological hedonism suggests that humans are naturally motivated by pleasure and pain, while ethical hedonism argues that we ought to seek pleasure and minimize suffering as a moral duty. But if pleasure is the ultimate goal, how do we distinguish between higher, more meaningful pleasures and mere sensory enjoyment? Critics argue that simple pleasure-seeking can lead to short-term gratification at the expense of long-term well-being. Hedonists respond that thoughtful reflection and moderation are key. True pleasure often involves intellectual, emotional, and social satisfaction, not just fleeting indulgence. But how do we balance desire, morality, and personal growth in pursuit of pleasure? Hedonism also raises questions about morality, responsibility, and the nature of a good life. If maximizing pleasure is the highest good, does that justify selfishness or harm to others? Or can pleasure be pursued ethically, in harmony with virtue and community? Ultimately, hedonism challenges us to ask, what brings genuine happiness? And how can we seek pleasure in a way that is thoughtful, meaningful, and sustainable? Consequentialism, judging actions by their outcomes. Consequentialism is the ethical theory that the morality of an action depends on its consequences. But what does it really mean to evaluate right and wrong based on outcomes? And can we always predict the results of our actions accurately? The most well-known form is Utilitarianism, which advocates for actions that maximize overall happiness or minimize suffering. But how do we weigh the interests of many people against each other? And how do we handle situations where all possible outcomes involve some harm? Consequentialism challenges rule-based or duty-based approaches to ethics, suggesting that the ends can justify the means. But is it ever acceptable to commit a morally questionable act if it leads to a greater good? This theory also raises practical and philosophical questions. How do we measure happiness, suffering, or benefit? Can we be confident in our ability to foresee the ripple effects of our actions? And how do we balance short-term versus long-term consequences in ethical decision-making? Ultimately, consequentialism asks us to focus on the impact of our choices. Should we prioritize outcomes over intentions? And how can we act in ways that promote the greatest good while navigating the uncertainties of life? Utilitarianism, maximizing happiness for the greatest number. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism that holds that the best action is the one that maximizes overall happiness or minimizes overall suffering. But what does it really mean to calculate happiness? And how do we weigh one person's well-being against another's? Philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill emphasize that moral decisions should consider the collective good. Every choice should be evaluated by its impact on overall pleasure, pain, or well-being. But is it possible to measure happiness objectively? And what happens when maximizing overall happiness conflicts with individual rights or justice? Utilitarianism encourages careful consideration of outcomes. It asks us to think beyond personal interests and consider the effects of our actions on society, future generations, and even non-human beings. But how do we account for uncertainty, unintended consequences, or competing values? Critics argue that utilitarianism can justify morally questionable acts if they produce greater overall happiness. Supporters respond that thoughtful, informed action guided by compassion and reason can lead to ethical outcomes. But can this approach truly guide everyday moral choices effectively? Ultimately, utilitarianism challenges us to focus on the consequences of our actions. How can we live in ways that promote well-being and reduce suffering? And how do we balance individual needs with the greater good in a complex and interconnected world? Deontology, following duty and moral rules. Deontology is the ethical theory that actions are morally right or wrong based on rules, duties, or principles, rather than their consequences. But what does it truly mean to act out of duty? And how do we know which rules are morally binding? Immanuel Kant, a key figure in deontology, argued that moral actions are guided by universal principles, such as the categorical imperative, which tells us to act only according to rules that could be applied universally. But can moral rules always be clear and absolute? Deontology emphasizes intentions and principles over outcomes. Even if a well-intentioned action leads to negative consequences, it can still be morally right if it follows duty. But what happens when duties conflict, or when following a rule seems to cause harm? This ethical framework also raises questions about responsibility, justice, and integrity. How do we remain faithful to moral principles in complex situations? And can rigid adherence to rules sometimes conflict with compassion or practical wisdom? Ultimately, deontology challenges us to consider the moral law within ourselves. How can we act with integrity, honor, and fairness, even when outcomes are uncertain? And how do principles guide us toward living a morally consistent and meaningful life? Moral relativism: is right and wrong absolute or contextual? Moral relativism is the philosophical view that ethical principles are not universal, but depend on culture, society, or individual perspective. But does this mean that morality is entirely subjective? And if right and wrong vary across contexts, can we ever truly judge another culture or person? Relativists argue that different societies have different values, norms, and practices, and these differences reflect diverse ways of understanding morality. What is considered ethical in one culture may be unacceptable in another. But how do we navigate conflicts when moral perspectives clash? This approach challenges the idea of universal moral laws or objective ethical standards. It asks us to consider context, history, and social norms when evaluating actions. But if morality is relative, does that lead to tolerance or to ethical uncertainty and confusion? Moral relativism also raises important questions about justice, human rights, and global ethics. Can we criticize harmful practices if morality is culturally dependent? And how do we balance respect for diversity with the need to protect vulnerable individuals? Ultimately, moral relativism asks us to reflect on the nature of ethical truth. Are there objective moral standards, or is morality always shaped by perspective? And how can we live ethically in a world full of differing values and beliefs? Moral objectivism: are some things always right or wrong? Moral objectivism is the philosophical position that certain moral principles are universal and independent of individual beliefs or cultural norms. But what does it mean to claim that some actions are inherently right or wrong? And how do we identify these objective moral truths? Objectivists argue that morality is grounded in reason, human nature, or universal principles, rather than opinion or custom. For example, acts like murder or theft might be considered wrong regardless of context. But how do we reconcile moral absolutes with complex real-world situations where outcomes vary widely? This view contrasts sharply with moral relativism, which sees ethics as context-dependent. Objectivism emphasizes consistency, fairness, and the search for universal standards to guide human behavior. But if morality is absolute, can it accommodate cultural differences, social evolution, or individual circumstances? Moral objectivism also raises questions about ethical authority, accountability, and judgment. How do we enforce or encourage adherence to universal moral standards? And how do we address situations where different moral principles appear to conflict? Ultimately, moral objectivism challenges us to consider whether there is a moral reality independent of human opinion. Are some actions truly right or wrong, no matter what society or individuals believe? And how can we apply these principles thoughtfully in our lives and communities? Social contract: why do we obey rules and governments? The social contract is a philosophical concept that explores why individuals agree to form societies and obey laws. But why do people give up certain freedoms to live under rules? And what makes a government legitimate or just? Philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau developed different versions of the social contract. Hobbes argued that without rules, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So we surrender some freedoms for protection. Locke emphasized natural rights, while Rousseau focused on collective will and equality. But how do we balance individual liberty with societal order? The social contract raises important questions about justice, authority, and civil obedience. When is it moral to obey laws, and when is civil disobedience justified? Can a government that fails to protect its citizens' rights still claim legitimacy? This theory also connects to modern debates about democracy, human rights, and social responsibility. How do we ensure that societal rules reflect fairness and the common good? And how do individuals contribute to shaping the laws and norms that govern them? Ultimately, the social contract challenges us to ask, why do we live in society, and what responsibilities do we have toward others? And how can we create social systems that are both just and sustainable in a complex world? Natural rights: what rights do we have simply for being human? Natural rights are the philosophical idea that certain rights are inherent to all human beings, simply because they exist, regardless of laws or governments. But what does it mean to have rights by nature? And which rights are truly universal? Thinkers like John Locke argued that life, liberty, and property are fundamental rights that governments must respect and protect. These rights are not granted by society. They are pre-existing and inalienable. But how do we define the scope and limits of these rights? The concept of natural rights has influenced constitutions, human rights declarations, and social movements worldwide. But challenges remain. How do we protect rights when they conflict, or when governments fail to honor them? Natural rights also raise deep philosophical questions. Are rights grounded in morality, human nature, or divine law? And if these rights are universal, How do we reconcile cultural differences and ethical disagreements across societies? Ultimately, natural rights ask us to reflect on the intrinsic value of human beings. What freedoms and protections are essential simply because we are alive? And how can we create societies that respect and uphold these universal human rights? Anarchism, living without hierarchies and authority. Anarchism is a political philosophy that questions the legitimacy of authority, hierarchies, and centralized power, advocating for self-governed, voluntary communities. But what does it mean to live without rulers or imposed laws? And is a society truly possible without some form of structured authority? Anarchists argue that hierarchical systems often lead to oppression, inequality, and coercion, and that people can organize collectively through cooperation, mutual aid, and shared responsibility. But how do we balance freedom with order and security? Different forms of anarchism emphasize various aspects of freedom, from individualist anarchism, which focuses on personal liberty, to social anarchism, which emphasizes communal well-being and equality. But how do communities resolve conflicts or ensure fairness without formal authority? Anarchism also raises questions about justice, ethics, and human nature. Are people naturally capable of cooperation and self-regulation, or is some form of governance inevitable? And can anarchist principles be applied practically in modern societies, or are they idealistic? Ultimately, anarchism challenges us to rethink power, authority, and social organization. How can humans live freely and responsibly without oppressive structures? And what would a society based on voluntary cooperation, equality, and autonomy look like? Libertarianism, maximizing freedom and minimizing government. Libertarianism is a political philosophy that emphasizes individual liberty, personal responsibility, and minimal government intervention. But what does it truly mean to prioritize freedom above all else? And how do we balance liberty with social responsibilities? Libertarians argue that people should be free to make their own choices, control their property, and pursue their own goals as long as they do not harm others. Government should exist mainly to protect rights, not to dictate moral or economic behavior. But how much intervention is acceptable when personal freedoms conflict with collective needs? This philosophy also raises questions about economic systems, social justice, and ethics. Should individuals bear full responsibility for their successes and failures? And how do we address inequality, public goods, or situations where people cannot fully protect themselves without some level of governance? Libertarianism has influenced debates on taxation, regulation, free markets, and civil liberties. But critics argue that too little government can lead to exploitation, social instability, or environmental harm. How do we ensure that maximum freedom does not undermine fairness and societal well-being? Ultimately, libertarianism challenges us to consider the value of personal autonomy. How can individuals live freely and responsibly? And what is the role of government in protecting liberty without overstepping its bounds? Liberalism, balancing freedom, equality, and rights. Liberalism is a political and philosophical tradition that emphasizes individual liberty, equality, democracy, and the protection of rights. But what does it mean to live in a society that values freedom and equality simultaneously? And how do we balance personal rights with social responsibilities? Classical liberalism focuses on limiting government power to protect personal freedoms, while modern liberalism often advocates for a role of the state in ensuring social welfare, education, and equality of opportunity. But how much government involvement is necessary without infringing on liberty? Liberalism also raises important questions about justice, economic policy, and human rights. How do we reconcile free markets with fairness and social support? And how do we address inequality while respecting individual choice? This philosophy has shaped constitutions, democracies, and legal systems around the world. But critics argue that liberalism can sometimes prioritize individualism over community, or struggle to address systemic injustices? How can societies remain both free and fair? Ultimately, liberalism challenges us to reflect on the principles of freedom, equality, and justice. How can we create societies that empower individuals while protecting the common good? And what responsibilities come with the rights we enjoy as citizens? Marxism, understanding society through class and economics. Marxism is a social, political, and economic philosophy developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels that emphasizes class struggle, economic systems, and the role of material conditions in shaping society. But what does it mean to view history through the lens of class conflict? And how do economic structures influence power and inequality? Marxism argues that society is divided between the ruling class, which controls the means of production, and the working class, which provides labor. Social change occurs through conflicts between these classes, ultimately leading toward a classless society. But is revolution the only way to achieve equality? This philosophy also critiques capitalism, highlighting exploitation, alienation, and inequality as inherent features. Marxists explore how economic systems shape culture, politics, and human relationships. But can Marxist principles be applied fairly in modern, complex societies? Marxism has influenced political movements, labor laws, and theories of justice worldwide. But critics argue that implementing Marxist ideas can lead to authoritarianism or economic inefficiency. How can the ideals of equality and fairness be realized without sacrificing freedom or innovation? Ultimately, Marxism challenges us to think about the relationship between economics, power, and social justice. How do material conditions shape human lives? And what would a truly equitable society look like in practice? Dialectical materialism, understanding change through conflict and matter. Dialectical materialism is a philosophical framework developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels that explains social, political, and historical change through the interaction of material conditions and contradictions. But what does it mean to see the world as shaped by matter and conflict? And how do opposing forces drive development and transformation? This philosophy combines materialism, the idea that the material world shapes reality, with dialectics, the method of understanding change through contradictions and their resolution. For example, class struggle is a key contradiction that propels society forward. But how do we apply this lens beyond economics, to culture, politics, or even personal life? Dialectical materialism challenges idealist approaches that prioritize ideas over material conditions. It suggests that social systems, institutions, and consciousness are rooted in economic and material realities. But can this framework account for human creativity, ethics, or individual agency? This approach has influenced political theory, social sciences, and revolutionary movements worldwide. But critics argue that focusing solely on material conditions may overlook complex cultural and psychological factors. How do we balance structure and agency in understanding society? Ultimately, dialectical materialism invites us to ask, how does change occur in the world? And how do contradictions in material conditions shape history, society, and our understanding of human development? Socialism, sharing resources for collective well-being. Socialism is a political and economic philosophy that advocates for social ownership, collective control of resources, and the reduction of economic inequality. But what does it mean to share wealth and power for the common good? And how do we balance individual freedom with collective responsibility? Socialists argue that economic systems should prioritize human needs over private profit, ensuring that everyone has access to health care, education, housing, and basic necessities. But how can resources be allocated fairly and efficiently? Different forms of socialism exist, from democratic socialism, which works within democratic frameworks, to more revolutionary approaches that aim to completely restructure society. But how do we maintain freedom, innovation, and personal initiative while promoting equality. Socialism also raises questions about justice, labor, and the role of government. How can society ensure that all people have equal opportunity and protection from exploitation? And how do we prevent corruption or inefficiency when wealth and power are collectively managed? Ultimately, socialism challenges us to reflect on the relationship between wealth, power, and human welfare. How can societies organize themselves to meet the needs of all citizens? And what responsibilities do we have to ensure fairness, equality, and dignity for everyone? Capitalism, freedom, markets, and the pursuit of wealth. Capitalism is an economic and political system that emphasizes private ownership, free markets, competition, and profit as drivers of innovation and growth. But what does it mean to organize society around markets and individual enterprise? And how do freedom and inequality interact in this system? Proponents argue that capitalism encourages innovation, efficiency, and personal responsibility, allowing individuals to pursue opportunities and improve their lives. But how do we ensure that competition does not lead to exploitation, environmental harm, or social inequality? Critics point out that unregulated capitalism can create wealth concentration, economic instability, and social injustice. How do we balance market freedom with the need for regulation, social safety nets, and ethical business practices? Capitalism also raises questions about values, purpose, and human welfare. Should economic success be the primary measure of achievement? And how do we ensure that markets serve society rather than merely profit-seeking interests? Ultimately, capitalism challenges us to reflect on the role of markets, incentives, and personal freedom. How can societies harness economic growth while promoting fairness, opportunity, and well-being for all? Communitarianism, balancing individual rights and community responsibilities. Communitarianism is a political and social philosophy that emphasizes the importance of community, social cohesion, and shared values alongside individual rights. But what does it mean to live as part of a community while maintaining personal freedom? And how do we balance individual interests with the collective good? Communitarians argue that individuals are shaped by social relationships, cultural norms, and shared responsibilities. Rights and freedoms are important, but they are exercised within the context of social obligations and communal life. But how do we prevent the community from imposing too much control over individuals? This philosophy raises questions about identity, ethics, and governance. How much should personal decisions consider societal impact? And how do communities nurture solidarity, moral development, and mutual support without stifling individuality? Communitarianism also influences debates about civic engagement, education, and public policy. How do we cultivate responsible citizens who contribute to the common good? And how do societies balance the need for social order with respect for personal liberty? Ultimately, communitarianism challenges us to reflect on our connections to others and the responsibilities we share. How can we live ethically and meaningfully within communities? And what is the role of society in shaping values, behavior, and well-being? Justice, seeking fairness, rights, and moral balance. Justice is a fundamental philosophical and social concept that concerns fairness, moral rightness, and the equitable treatment of individuals within society. But what does it truly mean to be just? And how do we measure fairness in complex, real-world situations? Different theories of justice explore different aspects of fairness. Distributive justice asks how resources, wealth, and opportunities should be shared. Retributive justice focuses on punishment and accountability for wrongdoing. Restorative justice emphasizes repairing harm and restoring relationships. But which approach best serves both individuals and society? Justice raises questions about rights, responsibility, and equality. How do we reconcile competing claims or interests? And how do we ensure that social systems are both fair and effective? Philosophers like John Rawls and Aristotle have offered frameworks for thinking about justice, from fairness as equality of opportunity to virtue-based considerations. But can any single principle capture the complexity of justice in diverse societies? Ultimately, justice challenges us to reflect on how we treat others and the kind of society we want to create. How can we uphold fairness, accountability, and moral integrity in our laws, institutions, and daily lives? And what responsibilities do we have to ensure that justice is realized for everyone? Distributive justice, fair allocation of resources and opportunities. Distributive justice is the concept that society should allocate wealth, resources, and opportunities fairly among its members. But what does it really mean to be fair in distributing goods and benefits? And how do we decide who deserves what? Philosophers have proposed different principles of distributive justice. Some argue for equality, giving everyone the same share. Others emphasize equity, distributing resources based on individual needs or contributions. But which approach best promotes a just and flourishing society? This concept also raises questions about economic systems, social policies, and moral responsibility. How should societies balance merit, need, and opportunity? And how do we address systemic inequalities or historical disadvantages in pursuit of fairness? Distributive justice is not just theoretical. It affects education, healthcare, taxation, and social welfare policies. How can governments and communities ensure that resources are allocated in ways that enhance well-being and reduce injustice? Ultimately, distributive justice challenges us to ask, how can we create societies where opportunities and resources are shared fairly? And how do we make ethical decisions about allocation that respect both individual effort and collective need? Retributive justice, punishment, accountability, and moral balance. Retributive justice is the philosophical and legal idea that wrongdoing should be met with proportionate punishment, holding individuals accountable for their actions. But what does it truly mean to punish fairly? And how do we balance justice with mercy or rehabilitation? This approach emphasizes moral responsibility. If someone commits a crime, they deserve consequences that reflect the severity of their actions. But how do we determine what punishment is appropriate? And what happens when the legal system is flawed or biased? Retributive justice also raises questions about ethics, societal protection, and human dignity. Is the goal simply to punish, or also to restore moral balance and deter future wrongdoing? And can punishment be both fair and effective without causing harm or perpetuating cycles of violence? Philosophers and legal theorists debate the limits of retribution. How do we account for intent, circumstance, or rehabilitation in assigning consequences? And how can societies ensure justice while respecting human rights and ethical principles? Ultimately, retributive justice challenges us to reflect on the moral responsibility of actions. How do we uphold fairness and accountability in human society? And how can punishment serve justice without undermining compassion or social cohesion? Authority, power, legitimacy, and the right to command. Authority is the concept that certain individuals or institutions have the recognized right to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. But what does it truly mean to have legitimate authority? And how do we distinguish between rightful power and coercion? Political philosophers and sociologists often differentiate authority from mere force. Authority is accepted by those who are governed, creating stability, order, and social cohesion. But what happens when authority is abused, unjust, or contested? This concept also raises questions about ethics, leadership, and governance. How much authority is necessary to maintain social order? And when is it morally acceptable to challenge or resist authority? Authority interacts with law, culture, and social norms, shaping how societies organize, enforce rules, and resolve conflicts. But can authority exist without consent, trust, or accountability? And how do we balance obedience with critical thinking and individual freedom? Ultimately, Authority challenges us to reflect on the nature of power and legitimacy. How can we recognize and exercise rightful authority responsibly? And how can societies ensure that authority serves justice, fairness, and the common good? Legitimacy. Why do we accept authority and power? Legitimacy is the philosophical and political concept that explores why people recognize certain authority or power as justified and worthy of obedience. But what makes authority legitimate? And why do some leaders or institutions gain acceptance while others are resisted? Legitimacy often depends on consent, fairness, moral justification, and adherence to laws or social norms. A government, for example, is legitimate when people believe it has the right to govern and act on behalf of the public. But what happens when legitimacy is challenged or undermined? This concept also raises questions about ethics, power, and social cohesion. How do we distinguish between authority that is morally and legally justified versus coercive or oppressive power? And how do societies maintain trust in institutions over time? Legitimacy influences governance, law, and civil obedience. Without perceived legitimacy, even effective authority can fail, leading to unrest or rebellion. But how can legitimacy be nurtured and preserved while balancing accountability, transparency, and effectiveness? Ultimately, legitimacy challenges us to reflect on the foundations of accepted authority. Why do we follow rules, respect institutions, or obey leaders? And how can power be exercised in ways that are ethical, just, and recognized as rightful by society? Civil disobedience, challenging laws and authority for justice. Civil disobedience is the philosophical and political practice of intentionally disobeying laws or authority to protest injustice or promote moral principles. But what does it mean to break rules ethically? And when is it justified to defy authority for a greater good? Thinkers like Henry David Thoreau, Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. emphasized that civil disobedience is nonviolent, principled, and aimed at creating social change. But how do we balance obedience to law with moral responsibility? This practice raises questions about justice, rights, and societal order. When is it morally acceptable to challenge laws, and when does disobedience threaten social stability? And how do individuals weigh personal risk against the pursuit of justice? Civil disobedience also challenges us to reflect on authority, legitimacy, and ethics. How can citizens hold governments accountable without descending into chaos or violence? And how do societies respond to peaceful resistance in ways that respect both order and justice? Ultimately, civil disobedience invites us to consider the moral obligations of individuals. How can we act courageously to confront injustice? And how can ethical resistance promote fairness, reform, and a more just society? Utopia, imagining the perfect society. Utopia is the concept of an ideal society where social, political, and economic conditions are perfect or near perfect. But what does it mean for a society to be truly ideal? And is a perfect world even possible? Philosophers like Thomas More envision utopias as places where equality, justice, and human flourishing are maximized. Utopian thinking challenges us to imagine how societies could be organized to eliminate poverty, injustice, and suffering. But how do we define perfection, and who decides what is ideal? Utopias also raise questions about human nature, governance, and ethics. Can people live harmoniously without conflict or selfishness? And do utopian visions inspire practical change, or are they mere fantasies that ignore real-world complexity? While utopian thinking can guide reform and inspire social progress, it also carries risks. Attempts to impose a perfect society can lead to authoritarianism or oppression. How can we balance aspiration with pragmatism and respect for diversity? Ultimately, utopia challenges us to reflect on our hopes for society and human flourishing. What values, structures, and relationships would make life just and fulfilling for all people? And how can imaginative visions guide real-world efforts toward a better society? Dystopia, exploring societies of fear, oppression, and chaos. Dystopia is the concept of a society characterized by suffering, injustice, and oppressive social control, often imagined as the opposite of utopia. But what does it mean for a society to descend into chaos or authoritarianism? And how do such visions reflect human fears and societal flaws? Dystopian narratives in literature, film, and philosophy often warn of the dangers of totalitarianism, extreme inequality, environmental collapse, or technological abuse. But what lessons can we learn from imagining societies gone wrong? And how do these scenarios challenge our assumptions about governance, ethics, and human nature? This concept raises questions about freedom, morality, and resilience. How do oppressive systems emerge, and why do people comply or resist? And what role does individual action play in shaping or changing society? Dystopias also serve as a mirror for contemporary issues, highlighting inequalities, social injustices, and moral compromises. But can imagining a worst-case society inspire real-world reform, or does it breed fear and cynicism? Ultimately, dystopia challenges us to reflect on the fragility of justice, freedom, and human flourishing. How can societies avoid the pitfalls of oppression, corruption, and inequality? And how can awareness of potential dangers guide us toward more ethical, resilient, and humane communities? Cosmopolitanism, thinking globally, acting ethically. Cosmopolitanism is the philosophical and ethical idea that all human beings belong to a single global community, and that moral obligations extend beyond borders and local affiliations. But what does it mean to consider ourselves citizens of the world? And how do we balance global responsibilities with local loyalties? Cosmopolitan thinkers argue that ethical principles should apply universally, emphasizing human rights, justice, and solidarity across cultures and nations. But how do we address conflicts between universal values and cultural traditions? This philosophy raises questions about governance, ethics, and global cooperation. How can societies promote fairness, equity, and human flourishing on a global scale? And how do we tackle global challenges like poverty, climate change, and inequality while respecting local autonomy? Cosmopolitanism also challenges nationalism, parochialism, and exclusive identities, encouraging a broader perspective on morality, law, and social responsibility. But can global citizenship be realized in practice, or is it an aspirational ideal? Ultimately, cosmopolitanism invites us to reflect on our moral obligations as humans, not just as members of a particular nation or community. How can we act ethically toward all people, regardless of borders or differences? And what steps can we take to create a more just, interconnected, and compassionate world? Aesthetics, understanding beauty, art, and human experience. Aesthetics is the branch of philosophy that explores the nature of beauty, artistic expression, and our experience of art and culture. But what does it truly mean for something to be beautiful or moving? And why do humans value certain forms of art over others? Philosophers examine questions like, what is beauty? Is it subjective, dependent on individual taste, or are there universal principles that define it? And how does art convey meaning, emotion, and truth? Aesthetics also explores the purpose and function of art. Does art exist for pleasure, expression, moral reflection, or social critique? And how do cultural context, personal experience, and societal norms influence our perception of art? This branch of philosophy intersects with ethics, culture, and psychology, asking how beauty and artistic expression shape human life. Can art inspire empathy, challenge conventions, or transform society? And how do we distinguish genuine artistic value from superficial or commercialized works? Ultimately, aesthetics invites us to reflect on the role of beauty and creativity in our lives. How does art enrich our understanding of the world and ourselves? And how can we cultivate appreciation, sensitivity, and insight through engagement with artistic expression. Existentialism, the philosophy of freedom and angst. Existentialism is not a single doctrine but a mood, a cry, a way of confronting human life. It begins with the recognition that existence comes before essence. We are thrown into the world without a fixed blueprint, and it is up to us to create meaning. But does freedom liberate us? Or does it burden us with unbearable responsibility? Thinkers like Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Martin Heidegger all contributed to this movement. Kierkegaard spoke of the leap of faith, the need to embrace meaning despite uncertainty. Nietzsche declared the death of God and challenged humanity to become creators of value. Sartre argued that we are condemned to be free, with no excuses, no divine plan, only choices that shape our being. But if everything depends on choice, what becomes of morality, tradition, or certainty? Central to existentialism is angst, the unsettling realization that nothing guarantees meaning. Life offers no ultimate script, only raw existence. Some collapse under this weight, others embrace it as radical freedom. Heidegger called this confrontation with the void being toward death, the awareness that mortality makes life urgent, not trivial, but is death the end of meaning, or the very condition that makes meaning possible. Existentialism resonates deeply with modern life, where people often feel alienated, disoriented, or trapped in systems that reduce individuality. It insists that no matter how suffocating the world may feel, the power to choose remains ours. We may not control circumstances, but we always control our response. So the existentialist question echoes still. In a universe without guarantees, will we shrink from freedom? Or will we embrace it and invent our own purpose?